All right, y'all. I have a phenomenal article here from Ryan Grimm, really highlighting a problem that's been bubbling and festering under the surface for at least 5 years now, probably longer. So this is in The Intercept. It's called "The Elephant in the Room. Meltdowns have brought progressive advocacy groups to a standstill at a critical moment in world history." So we're going to go through some of this here. The general gist of it is progressive groups that are supposed to be fighting for various super important issues are currently engaged in infighting, and their eye is totally off the ball. And as a result of that, you have the establishment Democrats and the right running rampant and getting victories all over the place. So it's really about how there's a culture of paralysis within progressive organizations that has rendered them completely and utterly toothless. And then that, I'm going to save something for you here at the end, which is really eye-opening about how important this is, and how, in a sense, it almost feels like an op. It almost feels like, there's right-wing infiltration of these groups, or the CIA has infiltrated these groups. And I know that sounds conspiratorial and crazy, but at the very least, the outcome is still the same, whether or not it's right-wing infiltration or CIA infiltration. Even if it is just genuine, sincere fighting among the left, the end result is exactly what the right wants, and exactly what the CIA wants, and exactly what the corporate Democrats want, because these groups are now totally and utterly useless. So let's dive into it here. Everyone acknowledged that Zoom was less than ideal as a forum for a heartfelt conversation on systemic racism and policing, but the meeting was urgent, and a little more than 2 months into the COVID-19 lockdown, it would have to do. During the first week of June 2020, teams of workers and their managers came together across the country to share how they were responding to the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, and to chart out what, if anything, their own company or nonprofit could do to contribute toward the reckoning with racial injustice that was rapidly taking shape. On June 2nd, one such huddle was organized by the Washington, D.C. office of the Guttmacher Institute, the abortion rights movement's premier research organization. Heather Boonstra, vice president of public policy, began by asking how people were finding equilibrium, one of the details we know because it was later shared by staff with PRISM, an outlet that focuses on social justice advocacy. She talked about the role systemic racism plays in society and ways that Guttmacher's work could counter it. Staff suggestions, though, turned inward, PRISM reported, quote, including loosening deadlines and implementing more proactive and explicit policies for leave without penalty. Staffers suggested additional racial equity trainings, noting that a previous facilitator had said that the last round had not included sufficient time to cover everything. With no black staff in the D.C. unit, it was suggested that Guttmacher do something tangible for black employees in other divisions. Behind Boonstra's and the staff's response to the killing was a fundamentally different understanding of the movement. For Boonstra and others of her generation, the focus should have been on the work of the nonprofit. What could Guttmacher, with an annual budget of nearly $30 million, do now to make the world a better place? For her staff, that question had to be answered at home first. What could they do to make Guttmacher a better place? Too often, they believed managers exploited the moral commitment staff felt toward their mission, allowing workplace abuses to go unchecked. Okay, so the general gist of this is, when the managers at Guttmacher ask that question, what they're looking for is somebody to say, hey, why don't we take $2 million in the budget, let's say, for argument's sake, and donate it towards this group which is trying to end the war on drugs, which in turn would reduce systemic racism, because as we know, the war on drugs is disproportionately applied to people of color. So that's what they're looking at, like policy reaction to try to help the entire country and affect the issue. The staff at Guttmacher were like, this is a moment for personal reckoning where we should turn inward and basically critique our own company. Okay, so let's continue. The belief was widespread. In the eyes of group leaders dealing with similar moments, staff were ignoring the mission and focusing only on themselves, using a moment of public awakening to smuggle through standard grievances cloaked in the language of social justice. Often, as was the case at Guttmacher, they played into the very dynamics they were fighting against, directing their complaints at leaders of color. Guttmacher was run at the time, and still is today, by an Afro-Latina woman, Dr. Herminia Palacio. The most zealous ones at my organization when it comes to race are white, said one black executive director at a different organization, asking for anonymity so as not to provoke a response from the staff. These starkly divergent views would produce dramatic schisms throughout the progressive world in the coming years. At Guttmacher, this process would rip the organization apart. Boonstra, unlike many managers at the time, didn't sugarcoat how she felt about the staff's response to the killing. Quote, "I'm here to talk about George Floyd and the other African-American men who have been beaten up by society," she told her staff, "not workplace problems." Boonstra told them she was disappointed that they were being self-centered. The staff was appalled enough by the exchange to relay it to PRISM. The Human Resources Department and Board of Directors, in consultation with outside counsel, were brought in to investigate complaints that flowed from the meeting. Wow. Including accusations that certain staff members had been tokenized, promoted, and then demoted on the basis of race. The resulting report was unsatisfying to many of the staff. What we have learned is that there is a group of people with strong opinions about a particular supervisor, the new leadership, and a change in strategic priorities, said a Guttmacher statement summarizing the findings. Those staff have a point of view. Complaints were duly investigated and nothing raised to the level of abuse or discrimination. Rather, what we saw was distrust, disagreement, and discontent with management decisions they simply did not like. A PRISM reporter reached a widely respected Guttmacher board member, Pamela Merritt, a black woman and a leading reproductive justice activist, while the Supreme Court oral arguments in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization were going on last December. A year and a half after the Floyd meeting, excuse me, I just woke up, so I might sound a little suspect. She offered the most delicate rebuttal of the staff complaints possible. Quote, "I have been in this movement space long enough to respect how people choose to describe their personal experience and validate that experience, even if I don't necessarily agree that that's what they experienced," Merritt said. "It seems like there's a conflation between not reaching the conclusion that people want and not doing due diligence on the allegations, which simply is not true." Boonstra did not respond to a request to talk from either PRISM or The Intercept. The 6 months since then have only seen a ratcheting up of the tension, with more internal disputes spilling into public and amplified by a well-funded anonymous operation called Repro Jobs, whose Twitter and Instagram feeds have pounded away at the organization's management. Quote, "If your reproductive justice organization isn't black and brown, it's white supremacy in heels co-opting a woman of color movement," blared a typical missive submitted to and republished on one of its Instagram stories. The news in May 2022 that Roe v. Wade would almost certainly be overturned did nothing to temper the raging battle. Repro Jobs told The Intercept its current budget is around $275,000. See, this is super sketchy, okay? So you have an organization that pops up specifically to criticize Guttmacher, and their posturing is from the left, and they're focusing on the internal disputes. That sounds to me like divide and conquer. That sounds like it could be a right-wing op, or it could be a CIA op. Because they're exploiting these rifts that already exist and making it so that even when Roe versus Wade is about to be overturned, this organization, which is specifically about reproductive rights, is nowhere to be found. That's astonishing, man. Anyway, let's continue. That the Institute has spent the course of the Biden administration paralyzed makes it typical of not just the abortion rights community. Planned Parenthood, NARAL, Pro-Choice America, and other reproductive health organizations had simply been locked in knockdown, drag-out fights between competing factions of their organizations, most often breaking down along staff versus management lines. It's also true of the progressive advocacy space across the board, which has, more or less, effectively ceased to function. The Sierra Club, Demos, the American Civil Liberties Union, Color of Change, the Movement for Black Lives, Human Rights Campaign, Time's Up, the Sunrise Movement, and many other organizations have seen wrenching and debilitating turmoil in the past couple of years. In fact, it's hard to find a Washington-based progressive organization that hasn't been in tumult or isn't currently in tumult. It even reached the National Audubon Society, as Politico reported in August 2021. Following a botched diversity meeting, a highly critical employee survey, and the resignations of two top diversity and inclusion officials, the 600,000-member National Audubon Society is confronting allegations that it maintains a culture of retaliation, fear, and antagonism toward women and people of color, according to interviews with 13 current and former staff members. Twitter, as the saying goes, may not be real life, but in a world of remote work, Slack very much is. And Twitter, Slack, Zoom, and the Office space, according to according to interviews with more than a dozen current and former executive directors of advocacy organizations, are now mixing in a way that is no longer able to be ignored by a progressive movement that wants organizations to be able to function. The executive directors largely spoke on the condition of anonymity for fear of angering staff or donors. Quote, "To be honest with you, this is the biggest problem on the left over the last 6 years," one concluded. "This is so big, and it's like abuse in the family. It's the elephant in the room, and no one wants to talk about. And you have to be super sensitive about who the messengers are. For a number of obvious and intersecting reasons, my race, gender, and generation, I am not the perfect messenger. But here it goes anyway." For progressive movement organizations, 2021 promised to be the year they turn power into policy, with the Democratic trifecta and the Biden administration broadcasting a bold vision of transformational change. Out of the gate, Democrats pushed ahead with the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, funding everything from expanded health care to a new monthly child tax credit. Republican efforts to slow walk the process with disingenuous counteroffers were simply dismissed. And then, sometime in the summer, the forward momentum stalled, and many of the progressive gains lapsed or were reversed. Instead of fueling a groundswell of public support to reinvigorate the party's ambitious agenda, most of the foundation-backed organizations that make up the backbone of the party's ideological infrastructure were still spending their time locked in virtual retreats, Slack wars, and healing sessions, grappling with tensions over hierarchy, patriarchy, race, gender, and power. Quote, "So much energy has been devoted to the internal strife and internal bullshit that it's had a real impact on the ability for groups to deliver," said one organization leader who departed his position. "It's been huge, particularly over the last year and a half or so, the ability for groups to focus on their mission, whether it's reproductive justice or jobs or fighting climate change. This is, of course, a caricature of the left, that socialists and communists spend more time in meetings and fighting with each other than changing the world. But in the wake of Donald Trump's presidential election and then Joe Biden's, it has become nearly all-consuming for some organizations, spreading beyond subcultures of the left and into major liberal institutions. My last 9 months, I was spending 90 to 95% of my time on internal strife, whereas before, that would have been 25 to 30% tops," the former executive director said. He added that the same portion of his deputy's time was similarly spent on internal reckonings. Quote, "Most people thought that their worst critics were their competitors, and they're finding out that their worst critics are on their own payroll," said Loretta Ross, an author and activist who has been prominent in the movement for decades, having founded the reproductive justice collective Sister Song. Quote, "We're dealing with a workforce that's become younger, more female, and more people of color, more politically woke, I hate to use that term in a way it shouldn't be used, and less loyal to the traditional way to a job, because the whole economic rationale for keeping a job or having a job has changed. That lack of loyalty is not the fault of the employees," Ross said, "but was foisted on them by a precarious economy that broke the professional social contract that has left workers with less patience for inequities in the workplace." Quote, "All my executive director friends, everybody's going through some shit. Nobody's immune," said one who has yet to depart. One senior progressive congressional staffer said that when groups don't disappear entirely to deal with internal strife, the discord is still noticeable on the other end. Quote, "I've noticed a real erosion of the number of groups who are effective at leveraging power, progressive power in Congress. Some of that is these groups have the organizational culture that things are affecting them," the staffer said. Because of the organizational culture of some of the real movement groups that have lots of chapters, what they're lobbying on isn't relevant to the actual fights in Congress. Some of these groups are in Overton mode when we have a trifecta. The idea in theory is that pushing their public policy demands further and further left widens the so-called Overton window of what's considered possible, thereby facilitating the future passage of ambitious legislation. Those maximalist political demands can also be a byproduct of internal strife, as organization leaders fend off charges of not internally embodying progressive values by pushing external rhetoric further left. But, the aide pointed out, there is legislative potential now. Quote, "There are wins to be had between now and the next couple of months that could change the country forever, and folks are focused on stuff that has no theory of change for even getting to the House floor for a vote." Sunrise is doing their Green New Deal pledge, the aide continued, describing the Sunrise movement-led effort to get elected officials and candidates to sign on to an ambitious climate commitment. The climate bill is still on the table. There's a universe where people are on the outside, focused on power and leveraging power for progressives in Congress. Instead, they're spending resources on stuff that is totally unrelated to governing. Nobody says, "Hey guys, could you maybe come and maybe focus on this?" The silence stems partly one senior leader in an organization said, from a fear of feeding right-wing trolls who are working to undermine the left. Adopting their language and framing feels like surrendering to malign forces, but ignoring it has only allowed the issues to fester. The right has labeled it cancel culture or call-out culture, he said. So when we talk about our own movement, it's hard because we're using the frame of the right. It's very hard because there's all these associations and analysis that we disagree with when we're using their frame. So it's like, how do we talk about it? Wow. That's astonishing. They're saying, like, look, we want to call out the bullshit from within our own movement, but if we do it, we'll just be labeled right-wing and dismissed, and it'll further embolden these crazy people. For years, recruiting young people into the movement felt like a win-win, he said. New energy for the movement, and the chance to give a person a lease on a newly liberated life, dedicated to the pursuit of justice. But that's no longer the case. Quote, I got to a point like 3 years ago where I had a crisis of faith. Like, I don't even know. Most of these spaces on the left are just not, they're not healthy. Like, all these people are just not, they're not doing well, he said. The dynamic, the toxic dynamic of whatever you want to call it, call-out culture, cancel culture, whatever, is creating this really intense thing, and no one is able to acknowledge it. No one's able to talk about it. No one's able to say how bad it is. The environment has pushed expectations far beyond what workplaces previously offered to employees. Quote, a lot of staff that work for me, they expect the organization to be all the things. A movement, okay. Get out the vote, okay. Healing, okay. Take care of you when you're sick, okay. It's all the things, said one executive director. Can you get your love and healing at home, please? But I can't say that. They would crucify me. Okay. So now this, look, I'm not even halfway through this article. I'm going to stop reading it now. I'm not even halfway through this article. This goes on. There are more, look at this. There are more examples of this. I mean, this is a highly, highly detailed piece with a number of examples of how the culture inside progressive organizations is horrendous. The progressive movement is eating itself from within. And like I said, it's almost certainly because of the organic culture that has developed on the left, where people have sort of embraced these cancel culture values where, like, the tiniest infraction and you go off on somebody and treat them like they're your worst enemy. But it certainly feels like a right-wing op or feels like a CIA op, because this is exactly what they want. This is exactly what they want. So I highly recommend everybody go read the rest of this article. This article is truly phenomenal, and it's a reckoning that's long needed. People have needed to talk about this for a long time, because you got to understand something. I witnessed this firsthand years ago with the creation of Justice Democrats. Because now, whatever you think of Cenk Uygur now, you know, at the time, he was one of the co-founders of Justice Democrats with me and Zach Exley and Shoykad Chakrabarti. And, you know, the whole idea was supposed to be this is like the Tea Party of the left. We're going to primary the corporate Democrats. We're going to get in people who are sort of in the model and the mold of Bernie Sanders. And what ended up happening was there was a staff mutiny. Why? Because Cenk Uygur wrote some politically incorrect blogs in, like, the late 90s, things he had already deleted, and they included some crass jokes that people thought were sexist, and they took as, like, you know, him seriously saying, like, one of the things he said was, like, obviously the genes of women are flawed because they don't want to sleep with me more. Now, that was a self-deprecating joke, but people looked at that like rank sexism. And so there was a staff mutiny, and they were like, look, either all of us go, the entire staff, or he goes. And so then he, being very selfless, was like, you know what? If it's better for the mission to get more Bernie types elected, fine, I'll go. And then I looked at that and I said, the culture of this place is super fucking toxic. And so, you know what? I'm gonna step down in solidarity with him. This is what I witnessed. Shit, what year was this? 2017? 2018? Something like that? And what this story is telling me is that this is occurring in every single progressive institution in the country, or progressive organization in the country. And we're at the point where they're stymied. They can't do anything. They're totally feckless. They're totally useless. At a time when Roe versus Wade is being overturned, the Guttmacher Institute isn't there for the fight because they're too busy internally bickering over some bullshit. It's astonishing. So I'm going to leave you with this. Look at this right here. This is, Crystal Ball tweeted this, from the CIA's Simple Sabotage Field Manual. Look at the highlighted parts. The CIA has said this. They, you know, hey, this is how you infiltrate and bring down groups. Bring up irrelevant issues as frequently as possible. Haggle over precise wordings of communications, minutes, and resolutions. Refer back to matters decided upon at the last meeting and attempt to reopen the question of the advisability of that decision. Stunning. Stunning. And even some of the other stuff. I don't know why she just highlighted this. There's make speeches, talk as frequently as possible at great length, illustrate your points by long anecdotes, and account your personal experiences. When possible, refer all matters to committees for further study and consideration. Attempt to make the committee as large as possible, never less than 5. Advocate caution, be reasonable, and urge your fellow conferees to be reasonable and avoid haste, which might result in embarrassments or difficulties later on. So basically, this is exactly what's happening in progressive groups. And this younger generation of activists has been taught, like, look, any little infraction, any minor little uncomfortability that you feel during the day, that's actually evidence of a larger systemic problem that needs to be addressed. And so you're a hypocrite if you're trying to, like, go to Congress and change laws for the betterment of all of society if you're not cleaning up your own house first. And that means addressing all of the uncomfortable stuff internally here. So let's bicker over our perceptions of racism and sexism and bigotry and toxic workplace environments as the right runs rampant and wins nonstop, and as we're totally stymied and can't do even the most basic things for our policy goals. Well, look, guys, as I've told you before, the only way for a left to ever win on anything is ruthless solidarity. It's the exact opposite of what's going on now. It's solidarity and eyes on the prize, and the only thing you care about is policy. That's the only way that the left wins. Everybody's got their eye on the ball, and everybody's got their eyes on the prize. And you're a relentless crusader for those things. And any sort of internal issues you have, yeah, you can work them out in due time. But you certainly don't drag an organization to a standstill to have these internal debates from now until the end of time while the right takes over the country and corporations run amok. So anyway, phenomenal article from Ryan Grimm. Everybody go read the rest of it. It's really important. The culture of progressive organizations right now is super toxic, and they're without a doubt eating themselves from within.